Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic is North to Alaska or South to Patagonia, presented by our wonderful expedition leader, Daniel Hagaman. Thank you so much for being here today, Daniel. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Great, thank you, Sunny. I feel really fortunate to be here today and to be able to share these experiences that I have and also work for Natural Habitat Adventures. I've had this idea for a long time for a webinar, and I've just had the opportunity to get it together now, but I've been traveling back and forth from my home base in Colorado, Western Colorado, up to Alaska. And then my home base in Colorado back down to Patagonia. I've been doing that for over 20 years now. Before that, I was teaching some field studies courses in those locations. And I've noticed over the years that there's a lot of similarities between what you see in Alaska and Patagonia, and I'd like to share those with you in this presentation. Aside from people speaking Spanish in Chile and Argentina, I find that the landscapes themselves are so very similar, where they have very similar geographical features, including the mountains and the glaciers and the volcanoes. And they really dominate those landscapes. And they're very dynamic landscapes. They're constantly changing, and that's probably why we're so attracted to go to these locations. And I find that if you've been to Alaska and you enjoy Alaska, you probably will enjoy Patagonia and vice versa. They're amazing places to visit. So I hope you have the chance to do that. In this presentation, I'd like to share some of those similarities and then also look at some of the differences between these places on a much smaller scale when looking at species and plants, flora and fauna that you might find. To begin, I'd like to begin with this image here. Some of you have been to Alaska. This is an image of the Chugach Mountains in the background, and this is Alaska in the wintertime. Anchorage, Alaska is the largest city in Alaska. It has almost 300,000 people, and the rest of Alaska only has about 730,000 people. It has an area that's greater than Patagonia. The next largest city in Alaska is Fairbanks, Alaska, at 30,000 people. And just to remember that Alaska, the latitude of Alaska, of Anchorage, Alaska, is around 61 degrees north latitude, which is different than the cities in the southern hemisphere, which I'll point out now. I like to compare these two cities because I feel like a lot of people compare Anchorage, Alaska to this town here in Patagonia, Ushuaia in Argentina, which is one of the southernmost cities. This city is quite a bit smaller than Alaska, about a third of the size of Anchorage, for example. It's only 77,000 people. Overall, I said that the area of Patagonia in Chile and Argentina is less than that of Alaska, but there are almost 3 times as many people and many more communities. Some of the major towns in northern Patagonia are Neuquén in Argentina and Temuco in Chile. You have Puerto Montt and Bariloche, and then you have Punta Arenas and Ushuaia down in the south. Now, Ushuaia, this town here, is at only 55 degrees south latitude. And on the other hand, Anchorage was at 61 degrees north latitude. So that is, there's some difference there in just the geographical location. So if you're going to travel to either one of these places, I'd like to bring this up. You could, 100 years ago, you'd have to travel in this way by boat. It might take you a few years to get there, like Captain Cook. You could take one of these boats, the Endeavor or the Resolution, and it would take you, in the 1700s, it might take you 3 or 4 years to travel. He was exploring, Captain Cook explored Patagonia area and went around Cape Horn in South America, but he also traveled up to Alaska area on his last voyage of the Resolution. I think this is, for the most part, we're not traveling this way anymore, but one of the ways that they would navigate from place to place. And I like to bring these two images up. This is the Alaska state flag. You can see the Big Dipper here, which is also called Ursa Major. And many of you know this constellation in the northern sky, which indicates and points out the Polaris, the North Star. And this might be used in navigating the northern hemisphere. And bears there's 3 different bears in Alaska, which is represented in the Big Dipper. You have the polar bear, the black bear, and the coastal brown bear, which is exemplified here in Katmai National Park. This is a coastal brown bear. In the southern hemisphere, you have a constellation that is also used in navigation. This is the Southern Cross. And it was used because it looks like a cross, obviously, but from the native people, the Tehuelche people or the Aonakink people, they thought of this constellation as the footprint of a rhea, which is a flightless bird similar to the ostrich that you have in South America. And I have a picture of the rhea here. It's also called the Nyandu or Choike. Another way you could travel from place to place, just a few years ago, this guy walked the 15,000-mile trip from Patagonia, Ushuaia, all the way to Prudhoe Bay, 15,000-mile hike through South and North America. And he did it in a year and a half. And this is, if you've heard of FKTs or fastest known times, there's only 2 people that have ever done this ever. The last known record was 6 years, but he did it nonstop for 1.5 years. I think this is mostly out of our league when it comes to visiting these places. So I tend to use as a model this animal here. Let's see, we've got the Arctic tern. Now, the prize, I like to bring this up, and I brought this up in my last presentation, but I can't mention both of these places without mentioning this animal. It's the world's farthest long-distance migrant. It's only a pint-sized bird. It weighs just 1/4 of a pound and has a wingspan of around 2 feet. And these tiny birds migrate from their Arctic breeding grounds and back to the Antarctic for feeding. And it's a round trip distance of about 44,000 miles every single year. So there's been a lot of recent studies done because we have smaller transmitters that are able to attach to the legs of these birds. And they've been able to find out that these birds tend to spend a lot more time migrating to the southern hemisphere, and they have some layover spots where they feed, and then they stock up on supplies. They'll feed for a while and then move around quite a bit as they're flying back to the northern hemisphere to their breeding grounds again in the spring. Then they will fly almost directly back. An interesting fact is the oldest Arctic tern was found to be 34 years old. So that means that if it migrated on an average of 44,000 miles each year, the bird would have flown just shy of 1.5 million miles in its lifetime. That's enough for 3 round-trip tickets to the moon, which is impressive for a creature that tiny. Interestingly enough, in the southern hemisphere, the Arctic tern doesn't look like the Arctic tern. It looks more muted because it's not in its breeding plumage. So this is an Arctic tern in its non-breeding plumage in the southern hemisphere. It doesn't have the black cap, and it doesn't have the reddish colored bill. This is the route that the Arctic tern takes to get down to the islands off of Antarctica. So I use that as my inspiration for flying. I don't have wings, so I guess I'm reliant on public transportation to get down there. Flights 3,000 miles to get from my hometown up to Fairbanks, Alaska. That's about twice that distance, a little bit more than twice that distance, 6,700 miles to get down to Punta Arenas in Chile. And even though these places are on the opposite sides of the world, there's so many different comparisons between the two places and so many similarities. And I notice this every time I go down. So I think one of the most important things to remember here is that both of these locations are located on the Ring of Fire, which is basically a volcanic, a tectonically active area. In Alaska and Patagonia, the part of the Pacific Rim, you can see all the volcanoes that are listed here, and I have those Alaska and Patagonia outlined. Some of the most active areas in the world are located in these places. The plates in Alaska, you have these plates that are moving. The Pacific plate moves northward onto the continental, underneath the continental plate, and subducts under the continental plate, allowing the formation of volcanoes and the prevalence of earthquakes. On the South American coast in Patagonia, you have the Nazca plate, which subducts under the continental plate and forms volcanoes and is tectonically active as well with earthquakes. So I'd like to bring up a few examples here. I don't want to scare you, but I also feel like these areas, to give you some specific examples, the two largest recorded earthquakes ever recorded have been recorded in Alaska and Patagonia. The largest quake in Alaska was in 1964, a 9.2 on the Richter scale. It's called the Great Alaska Earthquake or the Prince William Sound Earthquake, the Good Friday Earthquake. So Alaska receives over 1,000 earthquakes a month, both the small and large earthquakes. And if we go, this is Anchorage, Alaska in 1964. You take a look in 1960, there was the largest earthquake on record in Valdivia and Santiago in Chile. And the largest quake was located there as a 9.5. And they receive close to the same amount of earthquakes a year, about 12,000 a year. It's not any different than places in California that receive quite a few earthquakes. Now, like I said before, I don't want to, oh, sorry. There we go. I didn't move my, this is Santiago, Chile in 1960. And I don't want to scare you into going into these places because I feel like these places, they're interesting because they're dynamic. And I think that the geological phenomenon that are happening in these places make it a dynamic landscape that is visually stunning. And that the remoteness and just the rugged, raw landscapes inspire us to visit these places. And, you know, it's not, like I mentioned before, it's not any different than what you would have on the west coast of the United States in the lower 48. So the danger is worth the risk. You should come and visit. Going to go on to volcanoes. In Alaska, this is a volcano that we fly by. It's Mount Redoubt. When you're flying out to King Salmon from Anchorage out to Katmai National Park. This is one of the 40 active volcanoes that are in Alaska. This particular volcano erupted last in 1990 and then 2009. So it's been very active in the last few years, although there's not many people living in this area, so it doesn't affect many people. One of the volcanoes that erupted in fairly recent history, this is ash that was deposited by the Novarupta volcano in Katmai National Park. This eruption happened in 1912, and it's the reason that Katmai National Park exists to this day. National Geographic explorer Robert Briggs visited this place in 1916 to find this valley of, they called it the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. It's not smoking anymore, but they thought that this was declared a national park in 1917 because of the stunning geological features that was reminiscent of Yellowstone. This eruption was 30 times larger than Mount St. Helens. Sonny, you probably recognize this place. This is Pucón in northern Patagonia. This is a volcano called Villarrica. Chile has 92 active volcanoes and 500 potentially active volcanoes. This is near a town called Pucón in the northern region, or the lakes region of Patagonia, and it is continuously active. Another volcano that is near a town called Puerto Montt is viewed here. This is also a ski area, one of the few ski areas in the region. And I'd like to bring in, this is a volcano that recently in 2008, I guess that's recent geologically, in 2008, the Chaitén volcano erupted near Chaitén, Chile, in Pumalín Park. And as you can see on the right-hand side here, it is still visually very, very active. There's fumaroles. As you can see, these landscapes are constantly changing and active. The ash on the left-hand side was deposited on many of the plants that ended up dying off, but then resprouting. This is similar to what maybe Robert Briggs ended up encountering in Katmai National Park in 1916, where it was a very new landscape. There are a few newer volcanoes that have erupted in nearby Puerto Montt, one of them being in 2015, the volcano Calbuco, as well as in 2011, Puyehue. The Argentinians, they dislike the Chilean volcanoes because all the prevailing winds come from west to east. And so if there's a volcano that erupts in Chile, most of that ash tends to fall in Argentina and destroys both animal and vegetation on the Argentine side, but doesn't really affect the Chileans. All right, so we've looked at some of these similarities. One of the other similarities between these two regions is just the mountain building processes that are happening. One of the differences between the Alaska Range and the Patagonian Andes is really the size of the mountains. Both of them are rising. The tallest mountain in Alaska is Denali at over 20,000 feet. And we do have tall mountains in South America, but they're not necessarily in Patagonia. The tallest mountain in South America is Mount Aconcagua, which is at almost 22,800 feet. But that's north of what we're talking about here. The large summits in Alaska are 18. The second largest summit is Mount St. Elias. You've got Mount Foraker at 17,000. And then they go down, from there, 14,000, 16,000, 15,000, 14,000. But in Patagonia, the highest mountain is only 15,000 feet. And that's in the north. And most of the other mountains in the south, where we lead trips for natural habitat, are only around 13,000 is the highest mountain, St. Valentin. And that's in the Patagonian ice fields. And Fitzroy, you might know Fitzroy, that's only 11,000 feet. So just to give you a size comparison there, the mountains in Alaska are larger, more higher elevation. So why are there mountains and why are there glaciers in these locations? So it depends on the prevailing wind patterns. One of the other differences between Alaska and Patagonia is that the Alaska range runs east-west. So much of the moisture that comes off of the Gulf of Alaska ends up falling on the south and the western side of the mountains, depositing all that precipitation on the ice fields. You have the Harding ice field, which is 50 miles long. You have the Juneau ice field, which is 87 miles long. And you've got some large glaciers, one that's near like the Mendenhall Glacier and the Taku Glacier by Juneau. So you have the wet side of the mountains, and then on the dry side of the mountains there up towards Fairbanks is a rain shadow effect where there's a lot less precipitation that is falling in those regions. You might have upwards of 20 feet of precipitation on the south side and only 15 inches on the northern side of the mountains. This is similar to what happens in Patagonia, but the orientation is different. You have westerly winds here that pick up moisture from the Pacific Ocean, and they drop their moisture on the northern and southern Patagonian ice fields. And most of that moisture falls on that area. You can see that's all broken up into fjords. A lot of the moisture falls there, and then as the wind, as the air rises, it dumps its moisture, and on the other side of the mountains, on the east side of the mountains, it's incredibly dry, and you have the Patagonia steppe. So there are some areas on the east side of the mountains that has upwards of 7 meters of precipitation a year. And on the other side, there might be similar to what you have up in Alaska, possibly only 10 inches a year on those coastal areas because it's in the rain shadow. So I'm showing this image. This is a satellite image of the southern Patagonian ice field and one of those glaciers that we visit. I'll show some images of that here soon. But you see the difference between the two sides. On the west side, which is, it says 220 miles long, this is a series of fjords. So the ice caps and the glaciers tend to calve into saltwater fjords. And on the east side, the glaciers calve into freshwater lakes and then flow out towards the Atlantic. This is the Perito Moreno Glacier. It's about 2 miles across this entire glacier, and there's an incredible viewing platform here. But it looks very similar in some ways, and I'll show you some glaciers up in Alaska. You have the same phenomenon happening. This is also Perito Moreno Glacier. And this is a glacier in Kenai Fjords, Alaska, that we just visited this last summer. So like I mentioned before, this is Kenai Fjords. It's near Seward, Alaska. Instead of flowing and calving into lakes like the last glacier that we saw, this glacier flows into a saltwater fjord. Now, glaciers in both places, in Alaska and Patagonia, are retreating, shrinking in both mass and size over recent history. And you can see this is the exit glacier terminus. So, and how it's changed over since 1950. So you can see the extent of the glacier in 1950, which is that white line. And then now the current glacier is back towards the left, that tiny little tongue of a glacier. Patagonia has the same thing going on. This is Glacier Gray. I don't have a larger record of this back to 1950, but even in the last, since 1996, this glacier has significantly retreated back where you can see a lot more land area exposed. Now we're heading back up to Alaska. Not all glaciers are shrinking, but there are some significant examples. There's one that just this last summer, the Muldrow Glacier up in Alaska last surged over 60 years ago. It tends to surge once every 50 years or so, but this glacier has extended down the mountain at a rate much faster, 50 to 100 times faster than it's, I think 3 to 11 inches is what it was before it surged. And daily it is surging 30 to 60 feet a day up until July this year. So these are some interesting phenomena that are happening. Another similarity between Alaska and Patagonia is the incredibly long coastline. This is an area, there's a difference between coastline and shoreline. Coastline comes directly out from the coast and is that measurement, but the shoreline actually measures all the little inlets and peninsulas that you have along that coast, which includes all the islands. And if you looked at that coastline of Alaska and Patagonia on that shoreline, which is longer, you have some incredible distances. The shoreline in just the Chilean Patagonia, for example, is 64,000 miles long, which is 2.5 times the distance around the equator. And that is similar up in Alaska, has a very extensive shoreline and a lot of fjords and islands, and both of these places exhibit that. One of the benefits of having that long coastline, and I know we don't have bears down in Patagonia, but I will get into some of the animals here soon, but this coastline and those cold water rivers and lakes are perfect for salmon, areas where salmon thrive. Let's see here, hold on. There we go. This is actually, I know that salmon habitats, the habitat in Patagonia is also very good for salmon, even though salmon is not native in Patagonia. It has been naturalized in Patagonia through introduction. This is actually a king salmon that was caught down in the fjords of Patagonia. But also they have introduced salmon through escapes. They do a lot of salmon farming in the fjords because it's a perfect environment for that. There are some techniques that are being used now to improve the sustainability of salmon farming in the area, so they won't destroy the marine ecosystem. I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole other topic that I'd like to discuss some other time. We get into some of the vegetation. So we've talked about some of those big features, like the big landscape features that are similar, like you have the fjords, you have the glaciers, you have volcanoes, you have tectonic activity. And now we get into some of those differences, some of the smaller species-specific facts about each of these places. One of the interesting differences between Alaska and Patagonia is that Alaska has needle-leaved evergreens. You have white spruce, you have black spruce, you have Sitka spruce, you have cedars, you have these plants that they're needle leaves, they're conifer, in many cases they're conifers. In Patagonia, you don't have many needle-leaved evergreens. You have more broad-leaved evergreens like the common southern beech tree, which you see here on the right-hand side. And you have different species of beech. You have some that are deciduous and you have some that are evergreens. Here's another picture of Alaska and the Sitka spruce, kind of perched up on top of these fjords in Kenai Fjords National Park. And then you have the deciduous southern beech, the lenga trees, Nothofagus pumilio, down in Patagonia. It has a very different feel when you're in a forest down there. Another difference between the two locations is the prevalence of permafrost in Alaska. Much of the area, we're not talking about the far north so much as that interior area where you have discontinuous and sporadic permafrost areas. We do have permafrost in the southern hemisphere in Patagonia, but it's found mostly on tops way far south or on tops of some of the mountains, the high peaks in the central Andes. Also talking about some of the vegetation found in the area, both Alaska and Patagonia have a prevalence of berries that are utilized by animals and birds. Provides food for wildlife. This is the blueberry, bog blueberry, and the lowbush cranberry. And then in Patagonia, you have similar plants. You have currants, which you also find up in Alaska. And then you have also this plant here, which is called calafate. There's actually a city named Calafate in Patagonia. It's named after the Patagonian blueberry. There's no blueberries on this tree because I think this bird ate them all. This is a chinchol, or a rufous-collared sparrow. So we've talked about those large similarities in land formations. And now I'd like to make some comparisons between some of the animals that we might see in these environments. And the first one that I'm going to compare here is, here we have the caribou. And this is an open tundra area that you might have in Denali National Park. And these animals are herd animals, and they're really common in open landscapes with lots of available food. And they protect each other by kind of in their sheer numbers, operating as a herd, protecting each other. Here's a close-up of caribou in the fall with the fall colors. Now I'd like to make the comparison here between the caribou and an animal that we find very common in Patagonia, in that Patagonian steppe. Notice it's a drier environment, more grass. And this is a guanacos. And guanacos are relatives of the llama and alpacas. They're wild relatives. And they tend to be found in large herds like this. Here's just an image of the Patagonia steppe. So these large open areas. Another animal you might see in the Patagonia steppe is actually a relative of ostrich and emu. This is a Darwin's rhea, or nyandu. And I mentioned them earlier on. They're also related to tinamous, kiwis, cassowaries. And so they are flightless birds that tend to fulfill a similar ecological niche that the guanaco fill. Here we have an animal called the huemul. This is the Andean deer. This is a female, and it tends to be located in high up in the mountains in very solitary animals. They're kind of stocky and built a lot like a mule deer here in Colorado. Or up in Alaska, I think the best comparison of these animals might be the Dall sheep, where they're able to really handle themselves in that rocky mountainous terrain to get away from predators. Here's a Dall sheep close up. So getting into some of the predators. Pumas are one of the predators we find down in Patagonia, but we do not find them up in Alaska, interestingly enough. Although we have many predators in Alaska, there's a few cases where pumas have traipsed into Alaska and been either killed or found in Alaska, but it's pretty rare. There's also some other smaller cats in Patagonia, the guinea, and also the mountain cat. It's about the size of a house cat. And these are also other predators that you might find in Patagonia. In Alaska, you have a wide range of predators. You have wolves on the left-hand side here. You have coyotes, not in most of Denali, but on the eastern side of Denali, you have coyotes. You have lynx, you have wolverine, you have fox, you have bears. So the predators in Alaska are much more prevalent. At least there's different species. Similarity that I've always found between these two places, there's these fox that are very similar. This is a red fox from Alaska. This is a cross phase of a red fox, which has some darker coloration. And then on the right-hand side, you have the cupeo fox, which is the red fox of South America. And they might be getting small animals, rodents, and preying on those small animals in the ecosystem. And I'd like to take a look at the birds because I like birds so much and I do a lot of bird photography. This is just taking a look at some birds up in Alaska. All of us know the bald eagle, and it's immature bald eagle on the right-hand side. I find that it looks very similar to some of these birds that you find in the southern hemisphere as well. This is actually a black-chested buzzard eagle, which is found in Torres del Paine National Park and all through the region. But it also has a stage, its adolescent or juvenile stage is a darker mottled coloration on the right-hand side, very similar to what the bald eagle would have. And they might be, this is actually probably a bird that preys on more rodents and vertebrates on the landscape, but not so much a fishing bird. This would not be found near water like the bald eagle would. Another animal you might see, which has one of the largest wingspans in the world, is the Patagonian condor. These are kind of the cleaning up crew of Patagonia. And you have these in the northern hemisphere. A comparable bird would be the turkey vulture. You might also have these birds are also the ravens and crows, tend to be birds that tend to clean up after messes that are or dead animals. In South America, in Patagonia, you have this bird over here that looks a lot like a raptor, but it doesn't really have the talons that a raptor has. It's more of it's a bird that can't really rip open carcasses very well, so it tends to partake in what's left over and would fulfill, in many cases, the same ecological role as the raven or crow in the northern hemisphere. I can't finish this presentation without mentioning some of these other birds that you have along the coast. There could be a whole nother presentation on birds of Patagonia, but I find that these are some of the most charismatic animals that we have down there, this being the Magellanic and the Humboldt penguins. You can tell the difference between the two penguins because of the black stripe. The one that's bending over in the front there is a Humboldt penguin, which has one black stripe on its chest or neck. And as you look in the back, the ones that are standing are Magellanic penguins, which have two black stripes on its chest, one on its neck and one on its chest. Anyway, these are birds that we see in the Southern Hemisphere, and they're found. Magellanic penguin is found in both Chile and Argentina, and then the Humboldt penguin is found north of about 42 degrees south, and that follows pretty much the cold Humboldt current that flows north and hits Chile and flows north from there. A bird that we see in Alaska, which looks very similar to the penguin in the Southern Hemisphere, is the common murre. This is an animal. It's interesting to see them up on the cliff sides because it doesn't look like they don't really have great flying ability. You can see that they're kind of built for swimming a lot like a penguin under the water. They use their wings, and they have their legs are positioned really far back on their body, so they're awkward on land. But they do make it up into these cliff sides, and they nest up here with the kittiwakes, and they can dive down to upwards of 300 feet under the water to search for fish. I like to point out a few of these species. This is a black-necked swan that we have down in Patagonia. It's one of those beautiful, charismatic species that we'll find in high numbers in those estuaries. Very similar to the tundra swans and the trumpeter swans that we have up in Alaska. So we've talked about many of the similarities between what you have up in Alaska, which you see up there, those large landscapes of glaciers and volcanoes and mountain building. And we've also talked about some of those smaller things that might be a little bit different in each of these places. Like I said before, I could have done an entire presentation on birds of either one of these places. That might be a whole nother webinar. But I'd also like to, and I know we didn't touch on any of the marine wildlife, which I think that would be a whole nother topic to discuss later on. But I'd like to do that in a different presentation. I'd like to close by just presenting this. And I find that both of these landscapes, even though the geological features are very similar, there are some major differences between these two spots. And I think it's exemplified here with the largest and the smallest species of deer in the world. Up in Alaska, you have the moose, which can weigh upwards of 1,500 pounds, and it can stand about 6 to 7 feet at the shoulder. And you have over here in northern Patagonia, and even there are some cases in the Magellanic region in southern Chile, where they found this tiny little deer species called the pudu that is actually 1.5 feet tall at the shoulder. And I just feel like this is a good example of some of those differences that you have. And I'd like to ask you all that question. I think this is something that I've thought about every time I travel here, is that why are there differences in both vegetation and the animals found in each of these places, where you have an animal so large like the moose, and you have this animal in the same family that is one of the smallest deer in the world. And you just have more prevalence of large animals in Alaska, more animals like bears are found in Alaska, but not in Patagonia. Anyway, both places have unique animals and landscapes, and I'd just like to close by hopefully you'll use these stars to either get you, either if you haven't been to Alaska or if you haven't been to Patagonia. I hope you get a chance to visit those places in the future and come and discover some of the wonders of that environment.
Daniel, thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation. It makes me want to go back to both Patagonia and Alaska. But before we start the Q&A, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the questions field in your control panel. We've got some great questions, but please continue to send your ideas and thoughts. I want to start with a great foundational question, which is, can you please just define what permafrost is?
Yeah, so permafrost is ground that is frozen year after year. So it doesn't, there is permafrost that will, on the surface, that will melt out in the summer season. But what we really are talking about with permafrost is the ground that is consistently frozen solid year after year. That is, yeah, that's, I guess, the definition of what permafrost is.
Great.
Yeah.
So we have some birders online. One question is just in general, what kind of birds can you expect to see in Patagonia? And specifically, can you see toucans?
In Patagonia,
Mm-hmm.
there's no toucans, but there are some, there's the slender-billed parakeets. So they look very tropical. There's the slender-billed and the austral parakeet. But there are no toucans in Patagonia.
Got it. Would you, shifting gears here to glaciers, can you explain what you mean by the glacier was surging? And what is the theory that, that causes this phenomenon?
So glaciers tend to surge when there's enough, there's two parts to a glacier. You have the accumulation zone, and then you have the ablation zone. So the accumulation zone is where you have snow that is building up and it's turning to ice. And then that ice is then flowing down to the area where the glacier is melting out. And that's the ablation zone. And what happens sometimes is that the glacier will, because there's enough water that will melt out and build up and almost get up underneath the glacier and act as a lubricant to lift up that glacier from the bedrock and make that glacier slip down the mountain much faster than it would normally travel. And that happens with certain glaciers where there's enough pressure that builds up over time that glacier will then slip down the mountain, and it's almost like a slinky. It's the same mass of the glacier, but it's now extended out over a longer distance. Does that explain it?
Yeah, that was excellent.
Years or so for certain glaciers.
So continue with the glaciers. Do you know if Alaskan glaciers calve more frequently or at higher volume than those in Patagonia? Can you compare those situations at all?
If they have higher volume, there's many more individual ice fields in Alaska, where in Patagonia you basically have three. You have the northern Patagonian ice field, you have the southern Patagonian ice field, and then you have the ice field on Tierra del Fuego. And then there may be 50 glaciers that come off of, let's say, the southern Patagonian ice field, and they would extend out in all directions from that ice field. You have many more individual ice fields up in Alaska, where you have the Harding ice field, and others that are located nearby Juneau. But the Wrangels have their ice field as well. So I guess you'd have to add all of that up. I'm not sure mass-wise how much more there would be in Alaska than Patagonia.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then here's another one about the relationship between glaciers and climate change. Do you think that glaciers are shrinking because of climate change, or are there other factors, natural phenomenon, that you think are contributing regardless of climate change? Like, what's the natural lifespan of a glacier, and how much is climate change influencing it, I guess is another way to put it.
Well, I guess we, especially in Alaska, because it's much further north than Patagonia is south, we're noticing some increased temperatures where permafrost is melting out. Whether or not this is, due to human involvement or not, I think some of it is probably anthropogenic, but there is definitely documentation that is saying that it's warming. Glaciers are reduced in size and mass because of higher temperatures. So I'd say yes, probably climate change is affecting the glaciers in both of those locations.
Excellent. Well, just to share some comments with you, the Ring of Fire got some great thumbs up. Lots of people thought this was a very interesting presentation, and a couple said, I don't have any questions, but I just want you to know it was thoroughly enjoyable. So I think we'll end it there. I want to hand it back to you if you have any closing comments.
I don't really have any closing comments, but I really hope that all of you get a chance to, if you've been to Alaska before and you really enjoy that landscape, the huge landscapes and the scenery, then you will enjoy Patagonia as well, and likewise the other way around. They're very similar, and if you have a chance to travel more of Chile and Argentina, there's other spectacular spots. Patagonia is a wide region, and it gets up into even temperate rainforests, similar to Alaska. If you go south towards Juneau and Ketchikan, you end up getting into that temperate rainforest, which is a very different environment than you have in the north. So get out there and explore.
Daniel, thanks again for taking the time to present for us today. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, at our website, nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everyone.